The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Ambassador Helen Ross stepped inside, her boots clicking against the polished floor. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but nothing could prepare her for the sheer size of the room. The ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into artificial stars. Around her, representatives from 4 to 7 alien species sat in floating pods, their bodies ranging from crystalline structures to beings made of what looked like living water. Helen walked to the center platform. Every eye in the chamber fixed on her. She could already hear the chittering sounds, the low hums of conversation. They were talking about her. About humanity. And from the tone, she knew it wasn't flattering. She cleared her throat and activated the holographic display. Images of soldiers appeared above her head, men and women leaping from aircraft, their parachutes opening like flowers against a blue sky. Admiral Drexen leaned forward in his pod. His body was made of living crystal that reflected light in rainbow patterns. When he spoke, his voice sounded like wind chimes. Ambassador Ross, let me understand this correctly. Your soldiers jump from flying machines? With pieces of fabric to slow their fall? Laughter erupted across the chamber. It was a strange sound, mixing clicks, whistles, and harmonic vibrations from dozens of different species. But Helen understood it perfectly. They were laughing at her. At humanity. At everything she'd come here to offer. Trade Minister Quillock spoke next. His body was gelatinous, constantly shifting shape inside his containment suit. Ambassador, we live in an age of quantum teleportation. Our soldiers can appear anywhere in the galaxy within seconds. And you're telling us that humans still throw themselves at the ground and hope fabric catches them. More laughter. Helen felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her face neutral. She'd dealt with worse than this. Much worse. These paratroopers have served humanity for over 400 years, she said calmly. They've succeeded in missions where advanced technology failed. Sometimes the simplest method is the most effective. How charmingly primitive, Drexen said. His crystalline face seemed to glow brighter with amusement. We have matter displacement technology that can insert entire battalions anywhere in seconds. We have orbital drop pods with armor that can survive atmospheric entry at incredible speeds. Your fabric parachutes are museum pieces, not military assets. A tall being named Thexa activated his console. He had 4 arms and his skin looked like polished metal. Ambassador Ross, your application for military alliance is denied. The Council has reviewed humanity's tactical capabilities and found them lacking. Perhaps in another century, when your species has developed proper technology, we can discuss this again. Helen gathered her data tablets. She looked around the chamber one final time. Every face showed the same expression, whether alien or not. Condescension. Dismissal. Pity. Council members, she said quietly, I hope you never need to learn the difference between complex technology and effective tactics. But if you do, remember this moment. Remember that humanity offered to help, and you laughed. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, the chamber was already moving on to other business. The humans and their primitive jumping soldiers were forgotten before she even reached the door. What none of them saw was the dark ship at the edge of the solar system. It had been listening to the transmission. Recording everything. The ship bore a crimson insignia that would have terrified the council members if they'd known it was there. It was a Krell vessel. And the Krell Empire was always watching for weakness. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, orbiting Earth's moon, Sergeant Jack Miller stood in the drop bay of the carrier Valiant. Around him, 40 soldiers waited. They were the best of the best, the 501st Airborne. Every one of them had completed over 1,000 jumps. Every one of them was ready for combat. Word just came down from the council, Jack said. His face was weathered, marked by years of service. They laughed at us. Called us obsolete. Said our parachutes belong in museums. The soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Private Tom Baker, barely 20 years old, raised his hand. So what happens now, Sarge? Jack looked out the window at the stars. He'd been a paratrooper for 15 years. He'd jumped in desert storms and Arctic blizzards. He'd landed in hostile territory more times than he could count. And he'd learned one lesson that never changed. Now we wait, he said simply. Because sooner or later, they'll learn what every army in human history has learned. When everything else fails, when all the fancy technology stops working, when there's no other option left, that's when they call us. That's when they send the paratroopers. Lieutenant Emma Clark checked her equipment. She was Jack's second in command, and she'd served with him for 7 years. You really think they'll call? Jack smiled grimly. They always do, Emma. They always do. 3 weeks later, his words would prove true in the most terrible way possible. The attack came without warning on a quiet morning across 7 Council worlds. Admiral Drexen was reviewing supply reports when every screen on his ship suddenly went black. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. Emergency power kicked in, casting everything in dim red light. "Report," he shouted. His tactical officer's crystalline hands moved frantically across a dead console. "Sir, everything's offline. Shields, weapons, communications, teleportation hubs. Everything." "That's impossible," Drexen said. But even as he spoke, he saw through the viewport what was happening. Krell warships, dozens of them, materialized from nowhere. Their first shots hadn't been explosives. They'd been electromagnetic pulses that shut down every piece of advanced technology within range. The second wave came 30 seconds later. Without shields, the Council ships were defenseless. Kinetic rounds tore through hulls like paper. Boarding pods crashed into stations. Drexen watched in horror as his fleet, the pride of the Vexery Empire, was torn apart in minutes. On the fortress world of Theros 7, the situation was even worse. The ancient citadel had stood for 10,000 years, protected by the most advanced shield technology in the galaxy. Those shields died in the first 30 seconds of the attack. By the time anyone understood what was happening, Krell soldiers were already inside the walls. Commander Thax led the Krell ground forces personally. He stood in the citadel's main courtyard, watching his soldiers raise the crimson banner of the Krell Empire. Around him, captured Council soldiers knelt with their hands bound. The battle had lasted less than 3 hours. "Secure the manufacturing facilities," Thax ordered. "I want production of war materials beginning within 72 hours. This fortress will become our main supply base." His second-in-command hesitated. "Commander, the Council will attempt to retake this position." Thax laughed. "Let them try. Their precious technology is useless against our jammers. Their teleportation won't work. Their drop pods will be shot from the sky. And their shields." He gestured at the dead generators. "Already offline. This fortress is impregnable." Back at the Council's emergency headquarters, panic had replaced the usual calm efficiency. Trade Minister Quilox's gelatinous form was shaking visibly. "The Krell control Theros 7. If we don't retake it within 72 hours, they'll have access to manufacturing facilities that can build a war fleet capable of conquering half the galaxy." General Vecton slammed 2 of his 4 fists on the table. "We've tried everything. Orbital bombardment can't penetrate the Citadel's shields. We launched 2 waves of drop pods and lost every single one. Their anti-aircraft systems are too effective. We've lost 2,000 soldiers already." "What about teleportation?" someone asked. "Jammed," Vecton replied bitterly. "The Krell have damping fields covering the entire fortress. Our most advanced technology, everything we've spent centuries developing, is completely useless." The room fell silent. Every option had been exhausted. Every tactic had failed. The fortress that should have been impregnable from outside attack was now impregnable from inside, held by an enemy that had specifically prepared for every advantage the Council possessed. Admiral Drexen stared at the tactical display, watching the red marks that represented Krell forces. His earlier arrogance had evaporated, replaced by cold fear. "We need options. Any options?" A communication officer raised his hand nervously. "Sir, there's an incoming transmission from the human ambassador." "Put it through," Drexen said. Ambassador Helen Ross's face appeared on the screen. She looked tired but unsurprised. "Council members, I've been monitoring your communications. I believe humanity can help." Drexen felt his pride warring with desperation. Pride lost. "Ambassador, unless Earth has suddenly developed technology superior to ours." "We haven't," Helen interrupted smoothly. "But we have soldiers trained to do exactly what you need. We can insert a strike team behind enemy lines without shields, without teleportation, without drop pods. Without any of the technology the Krell are watching for." "Your paratroopers?" Quilox's voice still held a trace of mockery, though it sounded hollow now. "You expect us to believe that fabric parachutes can succeed where our technology has failed?" Helen's expression didn't change. "I expect you to do what desperate people do, Minister. Try something different. The Krell are watching for energy signatures, for shield emissions, for teleportation activity. They're watching for your methods. They won't be watching for ours because they won't believe anyone is primitive enough to try it." Thexa leaned forward. You're asking us to trust human soldiers with a mission that could determine the fate of billions. No, Helen said quietly. I'm offering you the only option you have left. The Krell have beaten your technology. They've prepared for everything you can do. But they haven't prepared for what we can do, because 3 weeks ago you sat in your chamber and laughed at us. The council members looked at each other. Every face showed the same conflict. Accept help from the species they dismissed as primitive, or watch the Krell build an unstoppable war machine. Finally, Admiral Drexen spoke. His voice was stripped of all its earlier arrogance. Ambassador Ross, we require your assistance. When can your forces be ready? The Valiant can reach Theros 7 in 18 hours, Helen replied. My paratroopers are already preparing. But council members, remember this moment. Remember what it cost you to learn that sometimes the old ways work precisely because they are underestimated. The transmission ended. In the drop bay of the Valiant, Sergeant Jack Miller looked at his assembled platoon. 40 soldiers, the best humanity had to offer. Every one of them knew what was coming. Every one of them understood the odds. Gear up, Jack said simply. We jump in 18 hours. Time to show the galaxy what paratroopers can do. The first thing Jack Miller noticed when he jumped was the silence. No engine roar. No wind noise. Just the distant hum of his oxygen equipment and his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Around him, spread across miles of empty space, 39 other paratroopers fell toward the planet below. 8 minutes. That's how long they would fall before reaching the atmosphere. 8 minutes of nothing but darkness and the slowly growing sphere of Theros 7 beneath them. Jack checked his altimeter. 180,000 feet. The air was still too thin to feel. He looked left and right, spotting the faint silhouettes of his team members. They'd spread into 4 groups of 10, each targeting a different section of the fortress. Alpha Team, sound off, he whispered into his radio. The signal was so weak it could barely reach a few miles. Alpha Team, 10 strong, Lieutenant Emma Clark replied. Bravo Team, check, Sergeant David Price said. Charlie Team, 9. Lieutenant William Foster's voice was strained. We lost Murphy. His main chute didn't deploy. Jack's jaw tightened. 1 dead before they even reached the atmosphere. Copy that. Delta Team. Delta, all present, Corporal Lisa Hayes confirmed. Maintain radio silence from here, Jack ordered. On the bridge of the Valiant, 3 council observers watched the tracking display in stunned silence. Minister Quillox's gelatinous form quivered. They're just falling. No propulsion. No guidance systems. Nothing. Captain Shaw nodded calmly. That's exactly the point, Minister. Your sensors look for energy signatures. My people are giving off less electromagnetic activity than a piece of space debris. To the Krell, they're invisible. Admiral Drexen watched the 40 dots descending. Extraordinary. And utterly insane. At that speed, even a small miscalculation means death. They won't miscalculate, Shaw said firmly. These soldiers have done over 1,000 jumps each. They know how to fall. 6 minutes to impact. Jack's suit began to glow faintly as friction built up. The atmosphere was getting thicker. He could feel it now, a gentle resistance that would soon become a roaring inferno of heat. Below him, the fortress grew larger. He could see Krell warships in orbit, their sensors sweeping space for threats. Not one of them detected the humans falling through the darkness. Private Tom Baker felt his heart racing. This was his first combat jump, and every instinct screamed that he was about to die. His training took over. Check altitude. Check body position. Scan for team members. Stay calm. Beside him, Private Rachel Green gave him a thumbs up through her faceplate. Even in the middle of a death drop, she was grinning. Tom shook his head. The woman was absolutely crazy. 4 minutes to impact. At 60,000 feet, the air became thick enough to really feel. The paratroopers' thermal suits began glowing red-hot. On Krell sensor screens, if anyone had been watching closely, 40 tiny heat signatures appeared. But the Krell sensors dismissed them automatically. Just meteorites burning up in the atmosphere. Nothing to worry about. Inside the fortress, Commander Thax reviewed security reports. The Council's last assault had been 12 hours ago. Every attempt to breach the fortress had failed. He felt confident, almost bored. Commander, his sensor officer said, minor meteor activity in the upper atmosphere. Nothing significant. Thax didn't even look up. Ignore it. Keep sensors focused on orbital approach vectors. The Council will try again eventually. 2 minutes to impact. Jack watched his altimeter spinning downward. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10,000. Below him, the fortress walls were clearly visible. Anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward, waiting for drop pods that would never come. 5,000 feet. 3,000. 1,500. Deploy. Jack shouted into his radio. 39 parachutes blossomed in the night sky. Black canopies, nearly invisible against the darkness. The deployment altitude was insanely low, just 800 feet, but it was the only way to avoid giving the Krell time to target them. On the fortress walls, a Krell sentry finally noticed movement. He squinted into the darkness, confused. What were those? Some kind of flying creature? Before he could raise an alarm, Jack landed hard on the guard tower. His momentum carried him into a roll. The parachute harness released automatically. In one smooth motion, he drew his sidearm and fired 3 rounds into the confused sentry's chest. All around the fortress perimeter, 38 other paratroopers landed in shadows and silence. In the command center, alarms suddenly started blaring. Commander Thax jumped to his feet. Report. Perimeter breach in sectors 4, 7, 9, and 13, his tactical officer shouted. But sir, there's no teleportation signature. No drop pod impacts. I don't understand how they... A security feed flickered to life, showing a human in black gear moving through the shadows with a combat knife. Thax stared in disbelief. Impossible. How did they get inside? His sensor officer was frantically reviewing data. Commander, I think they fell. From orbit. With primitive fabric deceleration devices. They jumped? Thax's voice rose. From space? That's insane. Yes, Commander. Which is exactly why our sensors never detected them. For the first time in his career, Thax felt genuine fear. An enemy crazy enough to fall from space was an enemy that couldn't be predicted by normal tactical analysis. Sound general alert, he ordered. All units to defensive positions. Find them and kill them. Now. But Jack Miller and his paratroopers were already moving through the fortress like ghosts. They had 8 minutes before the Krell organized a response. 8 minutes to sabotage the shield generators and power systems. 8 minutes to do what the entire Council fleet couldn't accomplish in 3 days. And they intended to use every single second. Emma Clark moved through the shadows like a ghost. Behind her, 3 members of Alpha Team covered their approach to the eastern shield generator. The massive structure hummed with energy, its surface crackling with protective fields. She pulled out shaped charges from her pack and began placing them on the cooling vents. These weren't fancy energy weapons or plasma explosives. Just old-fashioned C4 and thermite. Simple. Reliable. Deadly. 2 minutes to detonation, she whispered into her radio. Moving to next target. Jack Miller crouched behind a supply crate, watching Krell soldiers rush past his position. They were panicking, running in different directions without coordination. Their sensors couldn't track the humans effectively. No shield signatures. No energy weapons. Just flesh and blood moving through the darkness. When the patrol passed, Jack signaled his team. They moved quickly toward the main power core, their boots silent on the stone floor. Every paratrooper carried suppressed weapons and combat knives. When they encountered sentries, the kills were quick and quiet. Across the fortress, Sergeant David Price and Bravo team reached the western power junction. David planted explosives while his team watched the corridors. A Krell soldier rounded the corner unexpectedly. Private Rachel Green reacted instantly. Her knife flashed once. The Krell went down without making a sound. She dragged the body into shadows and returned to position, wiping her blade clean. Charges set, David reported softly. 3 minutes to boom. In the command center, Commander Thax watched his fortress descend into chaos on multiple security screens. Humans were everywhere, appearing and disappearing like phantoms. Every time his soldiers responded to one breach, another appeared somewhere else. How many intruders? He demanded. Unknown, Commander. Our estimates range from 30 to 50. They're using chemical propellant weapons with sound suppressors. Our sensors can barely detect them. Thax made a decision. Seal all critical areas. Flood the corridors with. An explosion rocked the building. Then another. Then 3 more in rapid succession. Shield generators 1 through 4 are offline, the tactical officer shouted. Western power junction destroyed. Another massive explosion shook the command center, this one much closer. Backup power offline. Commander, the shields are failing. Thax stared at the displays in horror. These primitive humans with their fabric parachutes and chemical weapons had done in minutes what the Council's advanced forces couldn't accomplish in days. They'd systematically destroyed every critical system in his fortress. At the main power core, Jack Miller placed the final charge and armed it. 60 seconds until detonation. He activated his radio. All teams, charges set. Rally at extraction point Beta. Alpha team moving, Emma confirmed. Bravo clear, David reported. Charlie en route, William added. Heavy contact, fighting through. Delta team pinned down. Lisa Hayes's voice was strained, punctuated by gunfire. We've got at least 30 hostiles between us and extraction. Jack's blood went cold. All teams, converge on Delta's position. Negative, Sergeant, Lisa interrupted. You complete the mission. Delta will hold them here and find another way out. Lisa, that's not. That's an order, Sarge. Her voice was firm despite the chaos in the background. Blow the core. Take down these shields. We'll see you topside. Jack looked at the timer. 40 seconds. He could abort the charges, try to fight through to Delta. But that would risk the entire mission. Millions of lives depended on those shields falling. It was the oldest choice in warfare. Save your people or complete the mission. Understood, Delta. Godspeed. Jack switched channels, his voice hard. Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, move now. 30 seconds. The team sprinted through corridors, Krell soldiers closing in from every direction. Ahead, Jack could see the exterior courtyard, their extraction point visible across open ground. 20 seconds. Run. Jack shouted. They burst into the courtyard just as the charges detonated. The massive power core exploded with a roar that shook the entire fortress. Chain reactions cascaded through every system. Shield generators collapsed. Power relays died. Every defensive system went dark. Above them, Admiral Drexen's fleet had been waiting for this exact moment. Energy beams lanced down from orbit, each one precisely targeted. Kinetic rounds hammered Krell positions. The fortress that had seemed impregnable was suddenly defenseless. 2 Council extraction shuttles screamed down through the smoke and fire. The lead pilot was a Vexary named Calix who'd volunteered specifically for this mission. Humans, this is Shuttle Alpha, he transmitted. 30 seconds to touchdown. Jack's team reached the landing zone. 27 paratroopers crowded into shuttles designed for 20. The doors were still closing as the shuttles lifted off. Krell soldiers burst into the plaza, firing desperately. Energy rounds pinged off the shuttle hulls, but Calix was already accelerating toward orbit. On the eastern rampart, Lisa Hayes watched the shuttles climb through the smoke-filled sky. Around her, the 4 remaining members of Delta Team prepared for their last stand. There they go, she said quietly. Job done. Krell soldiers were massing for a final assault. Lisa checked her rifle. 1 magazine left. Maybe 30 seconds before they were overrun. Anyone got something inspirational to say? Private George Harris asked. Lisa smiled grimly. Yeah. We're 501st Airborne. We jump into impossible situations and make them possible. She chambered around. Today, we became legends. They opened fire one last time, holding the position so their brothers and sisters could escape. 3 minutes later, orbital bombardment reached their position. There was nothing left but rubble and the remnants of Delta Team's weapons. But their sacrifice had saved 27 lives and broken an impregnable fortress. Inside Shuttle Alpha, Jack sat in silence as they climbed toward space. Around him, his surviving paratroopers were exhausted but alive. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd completed the mission. But 13 empty seats haunted him. 13 soldiers who'd followed him into hell and never came back. Private Tom Baker spoke up, his voice shaking but steady. Sarge, this was my first combat jump. I was terrified every second. But I'd do it again tomorrow if you asked. That's what Delta Team understood. Jack looked at his remaining platoon. Dirty, blooded, exhausted, but every single one met his eyes with pride. Let's go home, he said quietly. 3 days after the battle, the Galactic Council chamber looked exactly the same. But everything else had changed. Ambassador Helen Ross stood at the center platform again, but this time she wasn't alone. Beside her, still wearing his dusty combat uniform, stood Sergeant Jack Miller. The metal of his equipment still bore scorch marks from Tharos 7. The chamber was completely silent. No chittering. No mocking laughter. Just respectful attention. Admiral Drexen spoke first. His crystalline form seemed dimmer than before, less bright. Ambassador Ross, Sergeant Miller, 3 weeks ago I called your paratroopers obsolete. I called them museum pieces. I dismissed your offer of alliance. He paused. I was catastrophically wrong. Your soldiers accomplished in hours what our most advanced forces couldn't achieve in days. They succeeded because we underestimated them. More importantly, our enemies underestimated them. Trade Minister Quillox's gelatinous body rippled slowly. I mocked your soldiers for throwing themselves at gravity. Now I understand that act represents a courage we'd forgotten existed. You conquered gravity before you conquered space. We forgot what that lesson meant. Defense Coordinator Thexa stood from his seat, all 4 arms spread wide. Sergeant Miller, our analysts have reviewed your mission recordings. You had no shields, no teleportation, no advanced weapons. Yet you infiltrated the most defended fortress in this sector. How? Jack stepped forward, his weathered face calm. Coordinator, we succeeded because we didn't have those things. The Krell built their defenses to detect energy signatures, shield emissions, and teleportation. We gave them none of that. Just humans falling through space with parachutes that have existed for 400 years. He looked around at the assembled aliens. You spent thousands of years building incredible technology. But you forgot the most important lesson. The enemy adapts to your technology. The Krell jammed your teleportation. They shut down your drop pods. They neutralized your shields. They prepared for everything except one thing they thought was too primitive to matter. Fabric parachutes, Helen added quietly. The thing you laughed at became the weapon you needed most. General Vecton spoke from the upper gallery. Sergeant Miller, 13 of your soldiers died in that operation. Do you consider that acceptable? Jack's expression hardened. General, there's no such thing as acceptable when talking about lives. Every soldier we lost was someone's son or daughter. Corporal Lisa Hayes stayed behind with her team so the rest of us could escape. She knew she wasn't coming home. She did it anyway. His voice grew stronger. But you asked if it was worth it. 13 paratroopers died to save 7 worlds and millions of lives. They died doing what they trained for. They were soldiers. They understood sacrifice. So yes, it was worth it. But don't ever mistake worth it for acceptable. We'll mourn those 13 forever. The chamber fell completely silent. Thexa approached carrying a floating platform. On it rested a crystalline medal that seemed to contain actual starlight. Sergeant Miller, on behalf of the Council, I present you with the Star of Valor. Our highest military decoration. You're the first human to receive this honor. It's been awarded only 17 times in Council history. He placed the medal around Jack's neck. The crystal felt warm against his chest. This is awarded for extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds, Thexa said. You've earned it. So have all 40 of your soldiers. Jack accepted the medal but his voice was quiet. With respect, I want this held in honor of the 13 who didn't make it home. Especially Corporal Hayes and Delta Team. They truly earned it. Admiral Drexen stepped forward. That brings us to why we called this session. Ambassador Ross, 3 weeks ago we rejected your alliance application. Today we're not just approving it. We're requesting something more. The Council formally requests that Earth establish a paratrooper training academy. We want our forces to learn your methods. Helen raised an eyebrow. You laughed at our methods 3 weeks ago. Now you want us to teach them? Yes, Drexen said simply. We laughed because we were arrogant. We believed technology made us superior. Your soldiers taught us that sometimes the simplest tool, wielded with courage, beats the most complex weapon. Helen was quiet for a moment. We'll accept. But every species that sends soldiers must understand what they are signing up for. This isn't just about jumping from aircraft. It's about a philosophy. That courage matters more than technology. That sometimes you take risks computers say are impossible. That you trust your training in your team. When can the academy be operational? Thexa asked. 6 months, Helen replied. We'll establish it on Ganymede Station. Sergeant Miller will oversee the program. Jack's head snapped toward her. Ambassador. You're the right person, Jack, Helen said firmly. You proved these tactics work. Now teach others what it means to be a paratrooper. Jack looked at the medal around his neck. 13 lives. 13 names he'd never forget. He thought about Lisa Hayes and Delta Team, about Murphy whose chute failed, about Jenkins who died in atmospheric entry. All right, he said finally. But we do this properly. Every species sends their best. Training will be hard. Some will wash out. Some might die learning. And every graduate will understand they're not just learning tactics. They're joining a brotherhood that goes back to the first humans who decided jumping from aircraft was reasonable. Drexen actually laughed, a sound like crystal chimes. Sergeant, I suspect our soldiers will hate you by the end. Good, Jack replied with a grim smile. If they don't hate me, I'm not training them hard enough. You want real paratroopers? They'll learn the same way humans did. By embracing fear, mastering gravity, and understanding that sometimes crazy is exactly what wins battles. 6 months later, on Ganymede Station, Jack stood before 60 recruits from 12 different species. Some had 4 arms. Some had crystalline bodies. Some breathed different atmospheres. But they all had one thing in common. They'd volunteered to learn humanity's obsolete tactics. Welcome to jump school, Jack said, his voice carrying across the training ground. First lesson starts now. You're going to learn to fall. And by the time you graduate, you'll understand what every paratrooper knows. Courage and gravity don't need fancy technology. They just need soldiers willing to jump. Behind him stood a memorial wall with 13 names carved in stone. At the top, in burnished steel letters, was a simple motto that would become famous across the galaxy. We embrace the fall. The Galactic Council had laughed at human paratroopers. Then one sergeant and his team fell from the sky and changed everything. Now, across a dozen worlds, soldiers preparing for impossible missions whispered the same prayer before they jumped. Give me the courage to embrace the fall. And the galaxy would never laugh at paratroopers again.